My daughter's routine back surgery left her paralyzed, and the surgeon told us it was all in her head. When we finally got proof, he botched the surgery. He looked at my daughter and said, "I regret what happened, but it wasn't my fault." I stayed silent. That was 2 years ago. Yesterday, he was arrested for falsifying records. My daughter went in to get a microdiscectomy, a lower back surgery that should have took 60 minutes and had her walking that same day. But it took 4 hours and left her paralyzed from the waist down. Her surgeon, Dr. Dingus, was adamant that everything went exactly as planned. She's just having a hard time dealing with it psychologically, as if a 60-minute nap was the thing that severed the nerves between her back and her legs. My wife and I pushed back on this immediately. "This was supposed to be routine," my wife said, gripping Mackenzie's hand while I pointed out her inflated area around her lower back looked. Dingus barely glanced up from his notepad. "Swelling is normal. Give it 48 hours. 48 hours turned into 2 weeks, and Mackenzie still couldn't walk or feel anything below her waist. We practically lived in that hospital, camping out in Dingus's waiting room until he'd see us. Each time he got more irritated, more dismissive. By week 3, he'd stopped examining Mackenzie entirely, just sat behind his massive desk, explaining how we were the problem. I've done 500 of these surgeries. Your daughter is experiencing conversion disorder. The mind can convince the body of anything, especially in adolescence." He was already writing a referral to psychiatry. "Stop feeding her anxiety about physical causes." Mackenzie would wake up screaming that something sharp was stabbing her from inside. Dingus called it phantom pain. We begged for an MRI. He laughed and said he wouldn't enable our delusions with unnecessary imaging. The other doctors in that hospital would see Dingus's name on Mackenzie's chart and suddenly get very busy. One nurse pulled us aside and whispered that we should get a second opinion elsewhere, but when we asked her to put that in writing, she walked away. The week month was hell. Mackenzie tried to move her legs every morning, crying when they wouldn't respond. My wife and I took turns sleeping in Mackenzie's room because she'd wake up sobbing from the pain inside her spine. I remember we threatened to sue 1 month in. That finally got us an x-ray, even though Dingus marked it as not medically necessary, so insurance wouldn't cover it. $3,000 to prove what he already knew, he said. He made us wait while he reviewed it personally, then called us into his office with this smug little smile. Pristine, beautiful surgical work, no complications, no foreign objects, nothing abnormal. He held the x-ray up to the light like it was a trophy. "Will you finally accept psychiatric help, or do I need to report you for medical neglect?" I remember staring at the x-ray of my daughter's back, genuinely confused at how it really seemed in perfect health. I had no words for him, just stared at him while he shot back this cocky, "I told you so" smile. But despite her back being perfect, Mackenzie was still getting worse. She'd lost 20 pounds, couldn't sleep without pain medication. Dingus grudgingly prescribed for psychological comfort. We did 2 weeks of psychiatry where the lady took notes on her mental delusions, while Mackenzie insisted something was wrong inside her. That's when my wife said we were done. We drove 3 hours to St. Mary's Hospital. Different state, different system, no Dingus. The ER doctor was young, maybe 30. He took one look at Mackenzie's surgical site and immediately ordered an MRI. No questions about insurance, no lectures about psychological problems, just, let's see what's going on. The MRI tech was chatting with Mackenzie about her favorite shows while positioning her. Normal stuff. Then she went quiet, staring at her screen. She excused herself and came back with the radiologist. They whispered and pointed at the monitor. The radiologist's face was serious when he asked us to step into his office. "I need to show you something." He pulled up the MRI on his computer, turned the screen toward us. Even I could see it. This white metal thing against Mackenzie's spine, clear as day. "This is a 3-inch surgical screw. It's been pressing against your daughter's spinal cord for 2 months. The tissue around it is inflamed and infected." My wife grabbed my hand so hard I thought she'd break it. Mackenzie started crying, but it was relief. Pure relief. "I'm going to contact your original hospital immediately," he said. "This needs to be addressed today." We sent everything to Dingus's hospital administration. Within an hour, the chief medical officer called us personally, asking us to come in immediately. The conference room had the CMO, legal counsel, Dingus, and us. Dingus sat there looking irritated, like we'd interrupted his golf game. The CMO slid the MRI across the table. Dingus glanced at it. "This is obviously from somewhere else. Different machine, different imaging. They probably planted something to sue us." My wife stood up, shaking. "You're accusing me of faking my daughter's x-ray." But the CMO raised his hand sympathetically. "Dr. Dingus, look at this number." He pointed to something on the report. Dingus leaned forward. "So? That's the serial number of the screw, from our surgical inventory, from Mackenzie's surgery date." The CMO pulled out another paper. "This is your signature, confirming you used this exact screw. Serial number F47829. Dingus's face changed. Not all at once, but like watching ice crack on a pond. "But screws show up on x-rays," he said quietly. "Not always. Depends on the angle, the type of x-ray, surrounding inflammation. You know this." The CMO's voice was deadly calm. "You read the x-ray yourself instead of sending it to radiology. You told these parents their daughter was crazy when you left a screw inside her spine." Dingus was staring at the serial number. His hands started trembling. I always count my instruments. You missed one, but the x-ray was clean. I saw it myself first. You saw what you wanted to see." Dingus looked at Mackenzie in her wheelchair for the first time in 2 months. He couldn't say a word to anyone in the room. He realized he had just been caught faking the fact he'd paralyzed our daughter. Dingus pushed back from the table so hard his chair hit the wall, and he walked out without another word, leaving his surgical cap on the floor where it fell. The chief called security to walk us to this private waiting room while they figured out what to do next, and Mackenzie grabbed my hand tight. 2 hours later, their legal team showed up with this huge stack of papers, saying they'd do the surgery to remove the screw for free at their hospital. My wife told them no way was anyone from their hospital touching Mackenzie again, and the lawyer started writing everything down with his hands shaking so bad he could barely hold the pen. I took pictures of every single paper they put in front of us before we left for the hotel near St. Mary's. That night, we just sat there in the hotel room not talking, while Mackenzie kept trying to move her toes, and my wife kept seeing Dingus's face when he saw that serial number. I ordered food, but nobody touched it. The next morning, Dr. Smith from St. Mary's called saying the infection around the screw was spreading fast, and Mackenzie needed surgery within 2 days, or the nerves would die permanently. My wife's phone kept ringing with calls from Riverside's administration administration, but she sent them all to voicemail. Marcus Thompson showed up at St. Mary's that afternoon after my wife emailed him at 3 in the morning begging for help. He went through all our documents and said this was the clearest malpractice case he'd seen in 20 years and took the case right there. Day 3, they prepped Mackenzie for surgery, and Dr. Johnson brought in the neurosurgeon who would do it, explaining every step while my wife signed papers with her hand shaking, and I recorded everything on my phone. The surgery took 5 hours instead of the 2 they said it would. My wife walked back and forth in the waiting room, checking her phone every minute. 17 missed calls from Riverside, and 3 from numbers we didn't know. I just sat there looking at Mackenzie's wheelchair folded up in the corner. Dr. Williams came out looking tired and said the screw was out, but the damage was bad. The infection had spread along her spine, and she might get some feeling back, but probably not everything. My wife fell into me crying while I asked him to tell us exactly what that meant for Mackenzie's future. When Mackenzie woke up, the first thing she asked was if she'd dance again, and my wife couldn't answer, just held her hand. Then this nurse from Riverside named Patricia showed up out of nowhere and handed my wife a USB drive, said she made copies before they could delete everything, then left before we could ask questions. That night in the hotel, we plugged the USB into my laptop and found surgical notes, inventory logs, and these emails where Dingus talked to another surgeon the day after Mackenzie's surgery about a possible retained foreign object. The next morning, we took Mackenzie to start physical therapy at St. Mary's, and watching her try to move legs she couldn't even feel made my stomach hurt. The therapist kept pressing different spots on her legs, asking if she felt anything while Mackenzie just shook her head and tried to smile for us. My wife kept staring at how skinny Mackenzie's legs had gotten since she couldn't use them anymore. All that muscle from years of cheerleading just gone in 2 months. The therapist was nice, but she didn't sugarcoat things when she explained that without feeling in her legs, the recovery would be really hard. That same day, I called Marcus Thompson, this lawyer my brother knew from his car accident case. Marcus came to the hospital that afternoon and spent 3 hours going through everything, including the USB files Patricia gave us. He filed the lawsuit against Dingus and Riverside Hospital the next morning, asking for money for what they did to Mackenzie. So the doctor's name is really Dr. Dingus? That's quite a name for someone who left a screw in a patient's spine. I'm curious why they'd wait a whole month before threatening to sue. Seems like watching your daughter suffer that long would push most parents to act sooner. By lunch, the local news was already calling us about the story of the teen cheerleader paralyzed by a surgical mistake. Linda Reeves from Riverside called my wife's cell phone that night, begging for a meeting and saying Dingus had been suspended. She kept hinting about other cases we should know about, so my wife agreed, but only if Marcus could come too. We met at this conference room downtown where Reeves looked nervous and kept checking her phone. She told us 2 other patients had filed complaints about Dingus in the past year, but both got dismissed for lack of evidence. One of them died from problems after surgery. Then she pushed this folder across the table with a settlement offer if we agreed to never talk about what happened. Marcus told us not to take it. That night around 3 in the morning, my wife found Mackenzie crying in her hospital bed because she'd wet herself and couldn't feel it happening. The look on my daughter's face when we had to clean her up was the worst thing I'd ever seen. Neither of us said anything about what this meant for her future, but we both knew. 2 weeks after everything came out, I tried going back to work but couldn't focus on anything. During a presentation about quarterly sales, I just started crying and couldn't stop. My boss told me to take family leave, which I did. Meanwhile, my wife discovered our insurance company was refusing to pay for Mackenzie's surgery at St. Mary's because we didn't get their permission before transferring hospitals. Patricia texted my wife asking to meet at a coffee shop away from the hospital. She showed up with a folder full of operating room schedules that proved Dingus did 3 surgeries the day he operated on Mackenzie, when hospital rules said surgeons could only do 2. She said he was rushing to make a golf tournament that afternoon. One night we heard knocking and found Dingus standing on our porch with his wife. His wedding ring kept clicking on our kitchen table as his hands shook. He started crying, saying he'd been hiding hand tremors for months, and his wife begged us to think about his reputation and his kids. I grabbed him by the arm and pulled him out of my house while his wife kept yelling about how we were ruining their lives. Marcus started deposing everyone who was in the operating room during Mackenzie's surgery. The anesthesiologist admitted he noticed the surgery was taking way longer than normal, but didn't want to question Dingus. The surgical nurse said the instrument count was wrong after surgery, but Dingus counted again himself and said everything was there. Mackenzie started doing online school from her hospital bed because she was too embarrassed to go back to regular school in a wheelchair. Her cheerleading friends visited less and less. One day my wife heard one of them tell another girl it was just too depressing to visit anymore. My wife had to leave the room before she said something to a 16-year-old kid she'd regret. 2 months passed with Mackenzie still stuck in that wheelchair when Marcus, our lawyer from the firm handling the malpractice case, called about the medical board finally scheduling Dingus's hearing. 3 months out was the date they gave us. Marcus filed emergency paperwork that same day to get it moved up since Dingus was still operating on patients, but the board sent back a form letter about procedural requirements. My wife screamed so loud when she heard that I thought the neighbors would call the cops. She threw the phone across the kitchen and it shattered against the wall while Mackenzie just sat there watching from her wheelchair. That's when the journalist called, some woman from the Tribune who'd been digging into Dingus's past after hearing about our case through court filings. She had names and dates of 6 other patients over 5 years with weird outcomes after his surgeries. 3 of them died from what the hospital called complications, but the families never got answers. My wife spent 4 hours on the phone with her going through every detail while Marcus kept texting warnings about how this could hurt our legal case. The article ran 3 days later with Dingus's photo right on the front page under pattern of negligence in huge letters. By noon that day, we had a cease and desist letter from his lawyer threatening to sue us for defamation and emotional distress. My wife's Facebook started blowing up with messages from other families who'd lost someone after Dingus operated on them. The hospital put out a statement about conducting an internal review, but we knew that meant nothing. Mackenzie developed this nasty red spot on her lower back from sitting in the wheelchair all day, and the wound care nurse at her checkup went pale when she saw it. She explained how pressure sores can go from nothing to life-threatening infections in days for paralyzed patients, and showed us all these special cushions and positioning techniques we'd need to do every 2 hours. My wife just stood there realizing this was Mackenzie's Mackenzie's life now, constantly fighting just to avoid dying from sitting too long. Patricia, the nurse from Riverside who'd whispered to us about getting a second opinion months ago, called my wife crying one afternoon. Security had just escorted her out of the hospital mid-shift for violating patient confidentiality by talking to that journalist. She'd worked there 12 years, and they threw her out like trash with her personal items in a cardboard box. She said other nurses wanted to speak up about what they'd seen, but everyone was scared of losing their jobs now. Mackenzie had been doing physical therapy 3 times a week at the rehab center when something happened during her session. She was doing her usual exercises when she suddenly gasped and said she felt something in her left toe. Just a tiny tingle that lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it was the first feeling she'd had below her waist in 3 months. Dr. Brown, her neurologist at the new hospital, warned us not to get our hopes up too much because nerve regeneration is unpredictable and usually incomplete if it happens at all. My wife was going through our bank statements that week when she realized we'd burned through almost all our savings on medical bills and hotel stays near the hospitals. I suggested selling the house, but even that wouldn't cover half of what we already owed, not counting what was still coming. Then the insurance company sent this letter saying they were investigating whether to cover any of Mackenzie's ongoing care since the original surgery was supposed to be outpatient. The deposition happened the next week in some fancy law office downtown where Dingus sat with 3 lawyers in $1,000 suits. He claimed Mackenzie's paralysis was from an adverse reaction to anesthesia, not the screw, and his team had some expert witness with credentials longer than my arm backing him up. Marcus pulled us aside after and said, "This could destroy our case because juries tend to believe confident doctors with experts supporting them." The state medical board finally held their review of Dingus's license after we'd been pushing for months. My wife testified for 3 hours straight, breaking down completely when she described finding Mackenzie covered in her own waste that first week when she couldn't control anything below her waist. The board members nodded and took notes but said they needed further investigation before making any decisions. I started finding empty whiskey bottles in weird places around the house, like behind the lawnmower and under old tarps in the garage. When my wife confronted me about it, I admitted I'd been drinking just to get through the days because watching Mackenzie suffer while I couldn't do anything to help was killing me. She just looked at me with these dead eyes and said she was losing both of us, her daughter to paralysis and her husband to a bottle. That night I got a call from a blocked number and almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up, and this woman's voice said she was a friend of Patricia's, the nurse who'd helped us get the MRI, and she had something important to show me. We met at a Denny's parking lot at midnight where 3 nurses sat in a minivan with boxes of photocopied papers showing Dingus had changed surgical notes after the fact in at least 4 other cases. One nurse had even recorded him on her phone telling the staff to correct the paperwork after a patient had complications from a botched knee surgery. They handed me USB drives and folders, but wouldn't give their names because they still needed their jobs, and Riverside had already fired Patricia for helping us. I drove home with evidence that could destroy Dingus, but when I walked in the door, I found Mackenzie unconscious on her bathroom floor with empty pill bottles scattered around her wheelchair. My wife was doing CPR and screaming at me to call 911 while Mackenzie's lips were turning blue, and I dropped all those papers trying to get my phone out. The paramedics got her breathing again and rushed her to St. Mary's where they pumped her stomach and put her on a ventilator, while my wife sat in the psych ward waiting room, asking herself if fighting this case was worth losing our daughter. They kept Mackenzie for 72 hours on psychiatric hold, and during her evaluation, she told the doctor she'd rather be dead than spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair watching her parents fall apart. The psychiatrist doubled her antidepressants and recommended intensive therapy 3 times a week that our insurance wouldn't cover. 4 months into this nightmare, Marcus called saying Riverside's insurance company was offering $2 million to settle, but only if we signed papers promising never to talk about what happened to Mackenzie. He explained it would cover her immediate medical bills, but not the lifetime of care she'd need, and we had 48 hours to decide. I wanted to take it just to end this, but my wife said no. We couldn't let them buy our silence while Dingus kept operating on other kids. Why would these nurses risk everything by meeting in a parking lot at midnight? Something feels off about nurses keeping evidence of changed surgical notes for who knows how long instead of reporting it right away. That same week I moved into a Motel 6 because I couldn't handle watching Mackenzie suffer anymore and needed space to think without my wife crying every night. I missed Mackenzie's psychiatric evaluation, where she admitted she'd been saving pills for weeks planning to kill herself because she couldn't imagine living paralyzed forever. My wife faced that alone while I sat in a motel room drinking myself stupid and ignoring her calls. She rejected the settlement offer without me, and the next day Linda Reeves called her personally, warning that Riverside would destroy our family in court and hinting that my drinking and our marital problems would become public record. My wife recorded the whole conversation on her phone without telling anyone. A few days later, she noticed a black SUV following her to the grocery store, to Mackenzie's appointments, even to her sister's house. Marcus confirmed the hospital had hired private investigators to dig up dirt on us, and they were photographing me at bars, documenting my wife's breakdowns in parking lots, even following Mackenzie's friends to see if they'd talk. The investigators sat outside our house taking pictures of the beer bottles in our recycling bin and the notices from bill collectors taped to our door. The judge finally set a trial date for 8 months out, which Marcus said was actually fast since medical malpractice cases usually took 2 to 3 years. My wife did the math and realized Mackenzie would have been paralyzed for over a year before we even got to court, assuming she survived that long. When Mackenzie got released from psychiatric hold, she refused to try physical therapy anymore, telling her mom she'd accepted she'd never walk again and just wanted everyone to leave her alone. Dr. Davis explained that depression was common in spinal injury patients, but Mackenzie wouldn't even look at him, just stared at the wall while he talked about the importance of mental health and recovery. Month 5 brought another call, this time from Patricia's husband saying she'd tried to kill herself after losing her nursing license for helping us. She'd taken a bottle of sleeping pills, but he'd found her in time, and she was in the ICU at a hospital 2 counties over, broken, and blaming herself for not speaking up sooner about Dingus. My wife drove out to see her, and they cried together in that hospital room about the price of telling the truth when the system protects the doctors. $1,000. Back home, I discovered black mold growing in Mackenzie's bedroom from a roof leak we couldn't afford to fix since I'd been out of work for months dealing with all this. Our homeowner's insurance had lapsed from missed payments, so I just covered it with plastic sheeting and duct tape, and every night the sound of rain hitting that plastic reminded us how far we'd fallen. Marcus called the next morning with news that made me drop my coffee mug on the kitchen floor. He'd been digging through state licensing records all night and found something nobody was supposed to know. Dingus had gotten a temporary medical license 3 states over and was working at a walk-in clinic doing minor procedures on people who had no idea what he'd done to Mackenzie. I watched Sarah's face go white when I told her, then red. Then she grabbed her phone and started scrolling through her contacts for that journalist who'd been following our story. Within 2 hours, the reporter had confirmed everything, and by that afternoon, the story was everywhere online. The clinic fired Dingus before dinner, their statement saying they had no knowledge of his pending investigation, which was bullshit since Marcus found the info with basic Google searches. 3 days later, James showed up at our door looking like he'd aged 10 years. He stood there in the rain for a full minute before Sarah let him in, and he went straight to Mackenzie's room where she was doing her physical therapy exercises that never worked. He got on his knees beside her wheelchair and told her he was sorry for being a coward, sorry for running when things got hard, sorry for leaving them alone with all this. Mackenzie just stared at the wall while he talked. Sarah made him sleep on the couch but agreed to family therapy, though the therapist spent most of our sessions talking about accepting our new reality instead of fighting it, which felt like giving up to me. At the grocery store, Sarah ran into a woman who recognized her from the news coverage. This woman pulled Sarah aside near the frozen foods and told her that her son had been paralyzed by Dingus 2 years before Mackenzie. She said they'd found a doctor in Germany doing experimental nerve regeneration, but it cost $300,000 and insurance wouldn't touch it. She wrote down the contact info on the back of her receipt and pressed it into Sarah's hand before walking away. We looked up the treatment that night and found testimonials from people who'd gotten partial function back, but the price was more than our house was worth even if we could sell it with a mold problem. Month 6 brought the medical board's ruling, and Marcus warned us not to expect much. They suspended Dingus's license for 1 year with required retraining after that. Marcus called it exactly what it was, a slap on the wrist for destroying multiple lives. Sarah threw her phone so hard against the wall that pieces of screen went everywhere. The crash made Mackenzie flinch, her first real reaction to anything in weeks. The same week, Riverside Hospital sent out a press release saying Dingus no longer had privileges at their facility, trying to distance themselves from the mess. They claimed he was an independent contractor, not an employee, which Marcus explained was a common move to limit how much they'd have to pay in damages. Mackenzie started online therapy with a counselor who was paralyzed herself from a car accident 10 years ago. For the first time in months, Mackenzie actually talked to someone about maybe wanting to go to college online or learn graphic design from her bed. The counselor understood things we couldn't, like how to deal with people staring or the rage that came from dropping something you couldn't pick up. During discovery, Marcus spent weeks going through thousands of hospital documents. He called me at 2 in the morning, his voice shaking with excitement. He'd found emails between Linda Reeves, the hospital administrator, and the board discussing previous complaints against Dingus. Linda had personally reviewed and dismissed 3 separate incident reports because Dingus brought in $4 million a year in surgical revenue. She'd written in one email that losing him would mean cutting 2 other departments. This meant the hospital knew he was dangerous and kept him anyway. Sarah started a blog that week called Paralyzed by Greed, where she posted every document, every medical record, every piece of evidence we had. Within 3 weeks, it had 50,000 followers, and people were sharing their own horror stories about Dingus and other doctors who'd hurt them. Dingus's lawyer sent a cease and desist letter threatening to sue us for defamation. Sarah scanned it and posted it with the caption, "They want me silent," and it got shared 20,000 times in 1 day. Month 7. Mackenzie woke up with a fever of 103. The catheter she needed for her paralysis had caused a kidney infection that spread to her bloodstream before we even knew something was wrong. She spent a week in the ICU hooked to IV antibiotics while her body fought sepsis. I watched Sarah sit beside her bed for 7 straight days, not sleeping, not eating, just watching the monitors and realizing that the paralysis was just the start of a lifetime of medical complications. Marcus filed an amended complaint, adding Linda as a personal defendant for negligent supervision. The hospital's lawyers immediately filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that administrators couldn't be held liable for physician errors, that Linda was just doing her job. The judge scheduled a hearing for next month to decide if Linda could be personally sued for keeping Dingus on staff, despite knowing he was dangerous. The next morning, I set up the GoFundMe page while Mackenzie slept, typing out our story with shaking hands and uploading photos from before the surgery when she could still walk. Within 3 hours, we had $500 from complete strangers, then $2,000 by lunch, and by that evening, the counter showed $12,000 with messages pouring in from parents who'd been through their own medical nightmares. The local news station called asking for an interview, and I watched my wife cry on camera, explaining how we needed $400,000 for experimental nerve regeneration treatment in Germany that insurance wouldn't touch. That same week, Mackenzie started physical therapy again, and when the therapist pressed on her left thigh, she gasped and said she felt something. Not pain exactly, but pressure, like someone pushing through a thick blanket. Dr. Miller ran tests with pins and hot and cold water, marking areas on her leg where she could feel pressure but nothing else, explaining that some nerve pathways were trying to heal, but the damage was too severe for full recovery. Mackenzie grabbed my hand so tight when he said maybe 10% function could return with the German treatment, enough to possibly stand with braces. 2 days later, the cops showed up at our house asking if we'd heard about Dingus, and that's when we learned he'd been arrested that morning for practicing medicine after his license got suspended, some patient reporting him for doing consultations from his home office. The newspaper ran his mugshot on the front page looking like he hadn't slept in weeks, and by the weekend, every local station was covering how his wife filed for divorce and his kids legally changed their last names to their mother's maiden name. I felt nothing watching him fall apart, just empty, while my wife said at least he couldn't hurt anyone else. There's something strange about how Linda Reeves knew exactly which pressure points to hit: the drinking, the marriage problems, even having investigators ready to go. Makes me wonder how many times she's done this before to other families who complained about dangerous doctors bringing in millions. The hearing about Linda happened the next month, and the judge spent 2 hours reviewing all the complaints she'd ignored before ruling she could be held personally responsible for keeping Dingus on staff when she knew he was dangerous. Linda resigned from the hospital that same day with a statement about focusing on her legal defense, and within a week, 3 more families came forward saying Dingus had botched their surgeries too. Mackenzie surprised us in August by asking to go back to school for senior year, and even though my stomach twisted thinking about her navigating hallways in a wheelchair, we met with the principal who promised they'd install ramps and assign an aide to help her between classes. Her first day back, I drove her early and watched her wheel herself through the front doors, then sat in my car crying until my wife called saying Mackenzie texted that her old cheerleading squad had performed their whole homecoming routine in the gym just for her during lunch. Marcus called us constantly about pretrial motions, where Dingus's lawyers kept arguing the statute of limitations had passed for some of our claims, but Marcus shot back that concealing evidence meant the clock didn't start until we discovered the real damage. The judge sided with us on every motion, each small win feeling huge after months of fighting, though Mackenzie still woke up screaming some nights from phantom pains shooting through her dead legs. The GoFundMe had stalled at $50,000 when suddenly it jumped to $450,000 overnight from a single anonymous donation, and when I called GoFundMe, they said the donor specifically requested no contact, but left a note saying they understood what medical betrayal felt like. We started planning the Germany trip while Marcus prepared us for trial, scheduling deposition after deposition, and that's when Mackenzie had her worst panic attack yet during a prep session, where she had to describe the surgery. She started breathing so fast, describing how she woke up unable to move her legs, that the court reporter stopped typing and called for water, while Mackenzie clawed at her throat, gasping that she couldn't breathe, that something was wrong inside her again, that she was dying. I held her for 20 minutes while she shook and sobbed, and Marcus said we could take a break, but Mackenzie insisted on finishing because she wanted Dingus to pay for what he did. Patricia showed up the next week looking like she'd aged 10 years, her hands shaking as she sat for her deposition, and that's when she dropped the bomb that made Marcus actually stand up from his chair. She said she'd been at the hospital fundraiser the night before Mackenzie's surgery and saw Dingus at the bar doing shots with other doctors, saw him order round after round until past 2 in the morning when security had to help him to his car, and his surgery was scheduled for 7 a.m., meaning he'd had maybe 4 hours to sober up before cutting into my daughter's spine. Marcus immediately filed additional charges for performing surgery while impaired, and 2 days later the hospital's lawyers called with an offer of $8 million to make everything go away. No admission of wrongdoing, just a check and silence. My wife wanted to take it immediately, said we could set up Mackenzie for life and pay for the best care possible, but I couldn't stop thinking about Dingus never admitting what he did, never saying he was wrong, never apologizing to Mackenzie's face. We sat at our kitchen table with the settlement papers while Mackenzie stared at them, her hands steady for the first time in months as she picked up the pen. She put the pen down and pushed the papers away. Marcus looked at us like we were crazy when we told him no to the settlement, but Mackenzie was clear about what she wanted. She wanted to see Dingus in court and make him answer for what he did. Over the next few weeks, Mackenzie pushed herself harder in physical therapy, determined to show the jury she was fighting even if her legs wouldn't work. She'd grip the parallel bars until her knuckles went white, trying to drag her dead legs forward while the therapist spotted her. By month 11, she could transfer herself from bed to wheelchair without help, which sounds small but felt huge after everything. The criminal trial for Dingus practicing without a license came first, and we sat in that courtroom watching him in his expensive suit acting like this was all some misunderstanding. The prosecutor laid out how his medical license had been suspended pending investigation, but he kept seeing patients anyway, including Mackenzie. 6 witnesses testified they'd had appointments with him during his suspension. The jury took 40 minutes to come back guilty. The judge gave him 6 months jail time, but suspended it to probation and 200 hours of community service. My wife stood up so fast her chair fell over, but the prosecutor just shrugged and said, "Doctors almost never get real jail time for this stuff." 3 weeks later, we started jury selection for the civil trial, and Marcus spent hours grilling potential jurors about their feelings on malpractice. One guy straight up said he thought most lawsuits were just people trying to get rich quick. A woman admitted her brother was a surgeon, and she couldn't be fair. It took 3 full days to find 12 people who Marcus thought might actually listen. Between court dates, we flew to Germany, where this clinic had some new electrical stimulation treatment that might help with spinal injuries. The German doctors ran tests for 2 days, attaching electrodes all over Mackenzie's back and legs. When they turned on the machine, Mackenzie gasped and grabbed my hand because she felt tingling in her left foot for the first time in almost a year. The lead doctor said with their treatment protocol, she might get some sensation back, maybe even limited movement, but it would take months of work. We flew back for the trial, and Marcus's opening statement laid out everything, from the surgery that should have taken an hour to Dingus calling Mackenzie crazy for 2 months while a screw pressed against her spine. The defense attorney painted us as money-hungry opportunists who saw a chance to cash in on a routine complication. He actually used the word routine to describe my daughter's paralysis. My wife had to testify for 6 straight hours, going through every single day of those 2 months. Every time Dingus dismissed us, every night Mackenzie woke up screaming. The defense attorney kept pushing her, asking if she was exaggerating, if maybe she misremembered things. When they showed the before photos of Mackenzie at her dance recital on the soccer field, just walking down the street like any normal kid, my wife couldn't talk through her sobbing. I saw 3 jurors crying with her. Then came the cross-examination of Dingus, and that's when everything shifted. The lawyer asked about his state of mind before surgery, and Dingus admitted he'd had a few drinks the night before but said he wasn't impaired. A few drinks turned into half a bottle of whiskey when they showed his credit card receipt from the bar. When they asked why a 1-hour surgery took 4 hours, he claimed he was being extra careful, but the surgical notes showed multiple corrections and repositioning that shouldn't have been necessary. His whole attitude on the stand, the way he rolled his eyes at questions, the way he kept checking his watch like he had somewhere better to be, you could see the jurors getting more and more disgusted. Dr. Wilson from St. Mary's testified next, putting the MRI images up on this huge screen where you could see the screw clear as day pressing into Mackenzie's spinal cord. She explained how the infection pattern proved the screw had been there since the original surgery, not planted later like Dingus tried to claim. The defense brought their own expert who tried to argue the screw could have migrated from somewhere else, but when Dr. Wilson asked him to explain how a 3-inch surgical screw could travel through tissue without causing massive trauma, he just mumbled something about unusual cases. During a break on day 4 of the trial, Mackenzie went to the bathroom and didn't come back. We found her on the floor having a seizure, her whole body shaking while foam came out of her mouth. The paramedics said it was a complication from the spinal damage, something about disrupted nerve signals affecting her brain. The judge offered to delay the trial, but Mackenzie refused, said she'd waited long enough. They set up a video link from her hospital bed, and she testified while hooked up to monitors and IVs. She talked about the pain that never stopped, about watching her friends go to prom while she learned to use a catheter, about the future she'd planned that got erased by one man's mistake. Her voice stayed steady even when she described the humiliation of Dingus telling her parents she was faking, making her doubt her own body. When the lawyer asked what she wanted from this trial, she looked straight at the camera and said she wanted Dingus to admit he messed up and apologize for what he took from her. The video feed showed Dingus at the defense table staring at his hands, refusing to look at the screen where my daughter was speaking from a hospital bed she was in because of him. The next week, Patricia took the stand, and I watched Dingus's face go pale when she started talking about the records she'd found. She pulled out folder after folder showing how he'd changed surgery times in the computer system after Mackenzie's operation. The defense lawyer jumped up asking about her suicide attempt and her getting fired, but Patricia just kept her voice steady and said losing everything was worth it if it meant the truth came out. Linda got called up next and tried to act like she barely knew Dingus, even though we'd seen them having lunch together dozens of times. Patricia just happened to be at that fundraiser the night before and remembered Dingus drinking. After all these months, this crucial detail surfaces now when it helps the case most. The timing of her memory seems awfully convenient for building their case against him. Marcus pulled up email after email on the courtroom screen, showing Linda telling staff to schedule more surgeries with Dingus because he brought in the most money. Her perfect makeup started running when Marcus showed an email where she told a nurse to stop filing complaint forms about him. The defense brought in old patients who said nice things about Dingus, but Marcus had done his homework. One lady said her back was perfect after Dingus operated on her 5 years ago, but then Marcus showed her medical records from last year, where she'd been getting pain shots every month since that surgery. Another guy swore Dingus saved his life, but couldn't explain why he'd been on disability since his operation. During lunch break on Thursday, a juror collapsed and paramedics had to carry him out on a stretcher. The judge brought in an alternate juror who was this young mom who kept staring at Mackenzie trying to move her wheelchair around the tight courtroom aisles. When Dingus finally took the stand, his whole body was shaking and he kept wiping sweat off his forehead. Marcus held up the actual screw they'd taken out of Mackenzie and asked him to explain how it got there. Dingus's hands shook so bad he dropped it and it rolled across the floor making this awful metal sound. He kept saying he did nothing wrong, but then admitted he regretted what happened to Mackenzie, which made no sense if everything went perfect like he claimed. Marcus started asking him simple questions, and Dingus couldn't keep his story straight. First he said he always sends x-rays to radiology, then admitted he read Mackenzie's himself. He said he counted all his instruments twice, but then couldn't explain why the surgery report showed he only counted once. Marcus asked him 17 different questions, and Dingus answered every single one with some version of I don't recall or I don't remember. My turn came next, and I told them about watching my daughter scream in pain while this man called her crazy. I talked about my wife crying herself to sleep every night and how we'd spent our entire savings trying to get Mackenzie help. I pointed right at Dingus and told him he'd destroyed our family with his arrogance, and for the first time his lawyers didn't even try to ask me questions. Marcus gave his closing argument showing a timeline on a huge board with every lie, every misdiagnosis, every time Dingus ignored Mackenzie's pain. He asked for $30 million, which sounded crazy high, until he showed all of Mackenzie's future medical costs and the lifetime of care she'd need. The defense lawyer argued that mistakes happen, and that didn't make it malpractice, but even he looked like he didn't believe what he was saying. The jury went to deliberate, and those 3 days were the longest of my life. My wife couldn't eat anything, and I couldn't sleep more than an hour at a time. Mackenzie was still at St. Mary's doing physical therapy, and the doctors got excited because she could wiggle 2 toes on her left foot, which felt like such a tiny victory compared to everything she'd lost. My wife grabbed my hand in the hallway outside the courtroom for the first time since this whole nightmare started, and we just stood there waiting. When they called us back in the jury, Foreman stood up and I thought I was going to throw up. He read that they found Dingus guilty of malpractice and negligence, and that Riverside Hospital was liable for negligent supervision. Linda was found personally liable too, and had to pay damages from her own money. The courtroom went crazy with people gasping and reporters typing on their phones. Dingus just sat there frozen, staring at the table like he couldn't process what just happened. Mackenzie was watching on the video screen from her hospital bed and started crying, but it was relief, not sadness for once. The jury foreman stood up and read the final number out loud, and it was $45 million total, with $20 million of that being punitive damages to send a message about medical accountability. Everyone in the courtroom gasped because we'd only asked for $30 million, and this was the biggest malpractice verdict in Ohio history. Dingus's lawyer grabbed his arm and whispered something about insurance only covering $3 million, and I saw Dingus's face go completely white. The defense team immediately filed for an appeal right there in the courtroom and asked the judge to reduce the amount, but she denied the reduction, even though she granted the appeal process. Marcus told us afterward that appeals could take 2 years, but the verdict would stand during that time, and initial payments had to start coming. We were walking out of the courthouse when Dingus broke away from his wife and lawyer, who were trying to hold him back, and came straight at us. "I'm sorry, I was wrong. I destroyed your daughter's life because I was arrogant." My wife didn't say anything, but Mackenzie nodded on the video call we had running on my phone because she finally got the admission she needed. 3 months later, the medical board permanently revoked Dingus's license after their investigation, and the district attorney filed criminal charges for falsifying falsifying medical records. His assets got frozen pending payment of the verdict, and the local news ran stories about his complete fall from grace. Riverside Hospital's board fired all the remaining administrators who'd protected Dingus and implemented new oversight procedures with mandatory reporting systems. They offered Patricia her job back with a promotion to head of surgical nursing oversight, and she accepted because she wanted to make sure this never happened again. We took Mackenzie to Germany for specialized treatment at a spinal cord injury center that had new techniques American hospitals didn't offer yet. After 3 months of intensive therapy there, she regained partial movement in her left leg and could stand with assistance for a few minutes at a time. The German doctors said she might eventually walk with leg braces if she kept working at it every single day. Month 16 came, and Mackenzie graduated high school in a special ceremony the school arranged just for her. She walked across the stage using parallel bars with each step, taking enormous effort, but she made it all the way across. The entire auditorium gave her a standing ovation, and I saw Dingus watching from his car in the parking lot since he wasn't allowed on school property anymore. The appeals court finally ruled and upheld most of the verdict, but reduced the punitive damages to $10 million, which was still enough for Mackenzie's lifetime care. Dingus declared bankruptcy and lost his house and all his savings, and ended up working at a free clinic as part of his probation deal. During a follow-up surgery to address scar tissue that was causing more pain, Mackenzie went into cardiac arrest on the operating table. My wife and I waited through 4 hours of emergency intervention, not knowing if she'd make it, and it reminded us that her medical journey would never truly end. She survived, but needed weeks to recover, and we realized this would be our reality forever. The first settlement payment of $5 million arrived month 17, and we immediately set up a special needs trust for Mackenzie. We bought a fully accessible house with wide doorways and ramps, and installed therapy equipment in what used to be the garage. We hired home health aides to help with her daily care, because my wife and I were exhausted from doing everything ourselves. The money couldn't give Mackenzie her legs back, but at least we didn't have to worry about affording her care anymore. Mackenzie spent the next few months getting stronger in therapy, while taking online classes for her associate degree. She picked patient advocacy and pre-law courses, staying up late reading about medical malpractice cases between physical therapy sessions. The settlement money let her start a small foundation for people dealing with medical mistakes, and she sent her first grant check to Patricia's new whistleblower support group that helped nurses speak up about bad doctors. My wife and I decided to renew our vows on our 20th anniversary since we'd almost lost each other during the worst of Mackenzie's crisis. We kept it small, just family in our backyard with Mackenzie rolling up as maid of honor, cracking jokes about not having to worry about tripping in heels while everyone laughed and cried at the same time. The criminal trial wrapped up 6 months later with Dingus getting 2 years in minimum security for falsifying medical records. His lawyer read a letter at sentencing where Dingus finally admitted everything and apologized to Mackenzie, but she stayed home watching the live stream instead, telling us she needed to hear it but didn't want to see his face. 8 months into her German stem cell treatments combined with intensive physical therapy, Mackenzie stood up using leg braces and a walker, taking 10 shaky steps across the therapy room while Dr. Moore watched on video call from Germany, tears running down her face seeing the progress. We started family therapy around month 18, sitting in a circle talking about how we weren't the same people anymore, how the trauma changed us but maybe made us stronger, and Mackenzie shocked us by saying she wouldn't change what happened because it showed her what she wanted to do with her life. Sarah went back to work part-time at the bank, but spent evenings studying spinal injury research and medical law, getting invited to speak at hospitals around Ohio about patient advocacy and recognizing medical gaslighting. A documentary crew contacted us about filming our story, and we agreed because Mackenzie wanted other families to know the warning signs. And during one filming session, she walked 50 feet without stopping, the whole crew going silent watching her push through the pain with pure determination. Patricia called us crying when she won her wrongful termination lawsuit against Riverside, using the money to create nursing scholarships for students committed to patient advocacy, naming the first one after Mackenzie. Mackenzie walking across that graduation stage with parallel bars seems like such a carefully planned moment, doesn't it? Makes me wonder who arranged for Dingus to be watching from the parking lot. That detail feels too specific to be random chance. On the 2-year anniversary of the surgery, we drove back to St. Mary's with flowers for Dr. Smith, and Mackenzie walked into the hospital using just a cane, handing her a framed photo from her college orientation that Dr. Smith immediately put on her desk next to her computer. Mackenzie posted a video to her foundation's website from her dorm room, walking slowly but steadily from her bed to her desk, explaining that she'd never be 100% but refused to let Dingus's mistake set her limits. And the video ended with her sitting down and opening her medical law textbook for tomorrow's class, while I watched from home, finally seeing my daughter's future instead of just her pain. Kind of wild how those flowers showed up for Dr. Smith right on the anniversary. Makes you wonder if someone planned that way in advance or made a sneaky call ahead. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.